Western culture and English-speaking culture that I've consumed, there's a sort of thing behind, like, I don't know, we still haven't fully welcomed video games yet with as much warmth as we've welcomed film or literature. We're welcoming it. Certainly capitalism is welcoming it. I think still kind of a lot of everyday people don't really have, I don't know, like empathy behind the medium and behind maybe even the people who are involved in it. You know, so kind of unofficially calling it, maybe probably officially though, the beating heart behind. So you're going to be the first person on this because it just makes sense.
I've worked in video games for a long time. I was passionate about games as a kid and was very excited to get into the industry, and kind of worked my way through every position there was, like from starting a 3D artist to modeler, animator, designer, got into more technical stuff like programming, and just kind of did everything. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the industry, that you really get to dabble in a lot of different areas and kind of like bring things together. What I really spent a lot of my time doing was working with teams of designers, artists, and programmers, and trying to get them all like talking the same language to make something, which again for me is just a super fascinating part of the game industry. Is you have these disparate skills trying to create something together, and there's such different personalities and skill sets. The merging of these things can end up with something really exciting. So that to me was the kind of the central challenge that I focused a lot of my time on, is like, how do you get these different people talking to each other and making something together? So that's kind of like the backstory to how I ended up making PlayMaker, because I started my own company to do that, and kind of just built on a lot of the stuff that I'd been doing for other companies over the years to arrive at PlayMaker. I was also very excited. I was picking up Unity at the time. Unity was back then a revelation, because back then game companies were still all making their own engines, and
I can't even imagine.
And they were in a constant state of like kind of working. Or if you wanted any new feature in the pipeline, it was a big deal. And it was just like game development back then, before Unity and these tools we have today, was just really pretty painful,
Right.
in terms of pipeline and developing new ideas, so you're really dependent on a core team of engine makers, the developers, to like add features and keep them working, and designing them in a user-friendly way for artists and designers. Unity, when it came along, was just very empowering. When I picked it up, the one thing I kind of missed from the stuff I was doing before was some kind of higher level visual representation of logic, which was something I was focusing a lot on in my work with prototyping teams. Is that really seemed like an essential part of the process. You had to bring those different skill sets together, like some representation of the game all three departments kind of agree on. In my work, I settle on finite-state machines as this kind of representation that everyone could agree on and kind of like conceptualize, and it was kind of intuitive for everyone.
Yeah.
The idea of lower level visual scripting to me is always been a little strange, where you just convert every C# command into a node, and then you've got like 1,000 nodes, and you've exposed the entire API, and it's just like you've just kind of moved the problem to a different space, and you haven't really made it any easier for non-programmers to make stuff.
Right. Same problem, different look.
Exactly. So I've always come at the problem from a different direction, like how do we actually make it a higher level way to solve the problem, that actually kind of does get around having to learn low-level programming ideas,
Yeah.
And I think it's still a work in progress. It's a challenging problem. So it's another thing that we'll be doing for a long time, I think.
To go back a little bit to what you were saying when you started your own company to kind of to deal with this whole aspect of like bringing disparate parts of the process into one. Did you start like Hutong as like that was for PlayMaker, or was Hutong? Was there anything before PlayMaker? Like, is that the only thing that's tied to it?
Well, I started Hutong Games to make games.
Okay.
and
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And I started developing PlayMaker basically for myself because, like I said, I was getting really into Unity, but I was missing this high-level visualization of the logic. So I started writing PlayMaker based on, kind of ideas I'd been playing around with, and I was making it for myself for this game we were making that kind of got backburnered because
what is that, by the way? Would you mind talking a little bit about that? What was that project?
It was just a little arcade style 2D game. It was I'm very into pick up and play, kind of like super tight interaction loops. So it was just a little arcade game. I might pick it up again someday.
Do you have it laying it's laying around on a hard drive somewhere?
Yeah, it's just in kind of a prototype phase.
It's very interesting. So did you go from that directly into PlayMaker, or was there other projects in between?
No, the timing was pretty incredible. So just as I was developing PlayMaker, Unity came up with the asset store. Like when I was toying around with the idea of distributing PlayMaker, the part I wasn't so into was like, how do you advertise and like just find a channel for this and get it out? So I was not really that keen on that stuff. And then Unity just made that suddenly very easy with the asset store.
That is good timing.
So I was kind of it was incredible timing. I think we were one of the first things in there, and I was just kind of like, let's just give this a try,
right,
and see what happens with this. And that was 10 years ago.
I find that's like a really common part of like narratives in sort of, I don't know if revolution is too strong of a word to use, but in sort of like eras, or I think I've mentioned this to you before when we've talked about like game development and like cinema, the sort of similarities, but like it sounds kind of like the situation you were in was not completely dissimilar to maybe how like certain camera companies like Bolex made smaller, much more easy to carry like handheld cameras that then enabled sort of not studios but just everyday people to go out and make their own films. So it's interesting too, that's kind of like not only you making this tool, but also of course Unity being something available to the public, and then on top of that kind of like the cocktail is that when you started making PlayMaker, then putting out the asset store, like now democratization of sort of like how you can modify everything. That's crazy timing. Yeah. That's really crazy timing. I knew you were involved in other studio work, right? Like, so you kind of came from other places. What were some of those? Because I think Thief is the only thing I ever really kind of...
Yeah, I worked at Looking Glass for a while, which was an amazing studio. Did a lot of super innovative work. That was my first exposure to working with just teams of like brilliant people and how much that elevates a product, like that kind of collaboration, and how quickly you learn stuff from other people, working in the same room with them, going over to their computer and watching them make something. That was really eye-opening, I think, for me, was Looking Glass, that experience. And then after that, I worked at a company called Fang Games, and they made Zoo Tycoon, I think they're best known for. And that was a franchise I worked on, and that was one of the things that kind of, I got to see that product evolve and like be in the different roles of like going up from just 3D modeler to kind of lead artist and then technical art director, and just kind of like seeing the different aspects of the process from different angles was very interesting for me with that. And also the publisher relationship, that was very interesting, how that works.
What do you mean? What as far as the publisher stuff goes?
Well, just how the creative process interacts with your relationship with your publisher and what they want out of the product.
I see.
And how that kind of works.
When the suits get involved with the sweaters.
Because Zoo Tycoon, it did very well, so it became this thing that the publisher wanted to very carefully manage, I think, the growth of it,
I see.
And how so that was kind of like another new aspect of the game industry. It was a 20-year education in all the different forces at play in making games, or making games within the industry.
Right, I was about to say too that like if you said that's when you had your run-in with like the suits, does that mean then that like your time at the Looking Glass kind of was void of that they were sort of more independent and more just kind of riding on their own, like...
Yeah, I think it it was more a question of the role. I was like at Looking Glass, I was more just in the trenches, kind of like doing work and learning and
Yeah, what kind of stuff was that? I'm unclear of that too. What do you tell me about? Like, what are you doing there?
Looking Glass, I mainly worked on. There was a flight simulator called Flight Unlimited 3, and I was doing modeling all the cockpits and interior views. It was super interesting because we were working with a pilot who would make sure we were getting all the dials and stuff correct. So it was super technical, you know.
Ooh.
But it was also a lot of fun because we would get to fly in all these planes and take reference, photo, audio.
I remember you telling me a little bit something about that. Okay.
Yeah, so that was super. You know, I got to fly a beach jet. You know,
that's crazy. That's rad.
Yeah.
What an unexpected perk of this kind of job.
Yeah, it was super fun, and I still have I do have a soft spot for simulators. From going back to a kid, they are one of the most fun, I think, applications of it. You know, like the technology to just like try and capture the experience of a hobby or a something pretty technical like you never get to do otherwise, like flying a plane. You know, all its detail. You know. So that
does remind me too, like you, when the pandemic was kicking off, how you were saying that you were getting into Microsoft, the new flight simulator from Microsoft.
Yeah,
that is funny
because this looks amazing. I mean, and it's you can fly around the world, and the fidelity of the images is just insane.
Right. So you were modeling these planes. You took some trips on some planes. Was your work then like primarily modeling stuff then? With them?
Yeah, that was all 3D modeling. I was getting into the learning all the 3D modeling software and rendering. Some of it was like rendering promotional material, which was like print quality renders and stuff.
Right on.
This was before video cards were really powerful, so a lot of those interiors would be baked into a 2D image with cutouts for the view beyond it. So you. So the interior of the plane was actually something that took hours to render photorealistically, and not rendered in real time at all. You know.
So was it, just to appeal to the the nerdy specificities of this? Was this then a completely 2D image, or was it projection mapped onto lower poly geometry?
No, it was a 2D
completely
image.
Completely 2D.
Like
so then this was just like a UI with like that you can literally
exactly.
Okay.
With cutouts for the windows and the dials. There'd be little real time elements pasted in there for the dials and readers and stuff. It was a huge part of it was just rendered down to 2D. But that changed pretty quick. Like the product I worked on right after that was combat simulator. It was a World War II flight simulator, and that was already becoming real-time cockpits and real-time. So it was evolving very quickly, you know. And then that's a whole new skill set you gotta learn. Is like the real-time 3D optimizing for that, as opposed to baking everything into a render.
Yeah, totally different game. That you were there right for the turn of that. That's very crazy.
Yeah, and there was some just amazing 3D artists on that project that I learned so much from. Like the best way, if you have the opportunity, if you're learning like 3D Studio Max or any of those, if you have any opportunity to sit with someone who knows it well, it's the best way to learn it. You know?
I know, it's a dream I always think about with Unity even, and lately I've been trying to learn Blender more because I'm switching from Cinema 4D over to Blender, and I always think about that. I wish I've even looked up. I guess there are some sites that have one-on-one training with like Unity and stuff. It's like, what a dream it would be to just have somebody literally sitting right there, just be like, how do you do that? How do you do that? How do you do this? So that's crazy that you were there for that too. What did you use back then when you were kind of sitting there watching people doing modeling stuff? What was their software?
It was 3D Studio Max.
Okay, cool.
And I used Rhino for the like a lot of the high fidelity.
I don't even know what that is.
It's like a NURBS based. I think it's still going strong. I think people. Really? I haven't used it in a long time, but I think it's still popular and got its own like visual scripting plugin for procedurally modeling stuff. And it was a super cool program because it let you do very nicely smooth kind of like polished, manufactured looking things that were kind of hard to do in Max. But 2D Studio Max was way more suited to real time graphics, like low poly stuff you had to build in UV unwrap and do all that kind of stuff and get into the engine. So yeah, most of my early experience was 3D Studio Max. That's where all the muscle memory still is. It's like
Really?
I'm also trying to learn the Blender now, and
yeah, it's been a hard change for me because have you ever used Cinema 4D?
a tiny little bit, not much.
It is the most user friendly
Yeah.
application I've ever used. Like, period. It's insanely intuitive, man. To jump from literally, like, I've made a complete 180. You know, the most user friendly application, famously user friendly, and then going over to the notoriously not user friendly, almost like user hostile. You know, like, Blender's been driving me kind of crazy, but you know, I'm getting there. What about playing games as a kid? What is your history in sort of like game playing growing up?
This is gonna age me, but
Please.
I remember going to. I mean, my first computer was like a ZX80, and then I got a BBC Micro, which I think was probably England only. I don't know if you guys had it in the States.
Oh, that's right. Because this is another thing too. I forget that you grew up in the UK.
Yeah.
Okay.
And back then you would buy games on audio cassette.
Right.
Like you had audio cassette player you'd load them off of, and you could hear them loading. Or if the tape got jammed, you had to like get your pencil out and like rewind the tape and try and uncrinkle it. And
God, what a difference.
and same thing if you were making your own games, you were like, you know, coding and then saving it to an audio cassette.
Right. Did you ever make your own games? Put them on audio cassette?
Yeah, I played around with a little programming just because I wanted to like see how they were made.
What programming languages were you using?
I think it was just basic back then. You would buy like magazines that would have code listings in the back for like, this is how you make Snake, and you would type it in.
Yeah.
And if you didn't have some way to save it, you know, then you would just type it in, press run, and then when you turned off the computer, it was gone.
Oh my God.
I mean, it was very different days, but it was super amazing way to learn, I think, because it was so close to the metal. You know, like you would type in. You would just buy a magazine and type in the source code, you know, and it was short enough that you could kind of see the whole thing in your head. You could get, nowadays, you know, a program is, you're pulling together so many libraries and different things to make something. It's this thing you can't really hold in your head anymore. Whereas back then it was so simple, and you could really wrap your head around the whole thing and understand how the whole thing worked, which I think was kind of a really good introduction to the process.
Right.
Same thing with 3D graphics. I feel lucky in a way to have got in at the early days where it was so primitive. You got to understand the underpinnings, the foundation of it all. Like the first 3D program I used was called Povray, and you typed text descriptions of the shapes. This is a cube, and you use constructive solid geometry to like combine a cube and a sphere, and to make bevels you had to like work out. You get out the graph paper and draw it out, and then figure out.
I think I've seen some pictures of something where you're literally entering coordinates for vertices and stuff like that.
Exactly.
That is.
Yeah. Oh. And it's in a way, it's brutal, but it's also you're learning at a low level how these things are represented. You know?
Right.
The output. It was a ray tracer, and you could get some pretty neat looking images out of that thing. It was just the work of inputting it was pretty arduous.
That is fascinating. That's crazy. I can't imagine like sitting there like entering numbers to create like essentially a cube. What that feels like have you ever like messed around with Houdini?
A little bit, yeah. I've always wanted to get into, but it seems like a huge time investment to get.
Oh yeah. That's I think so.
Good at it. Yeah.
I spent like a week trying to pick it up, and again, it's like everything's procedural. It's like I didn't realize that the lesson I had been taking for the past 3 hours was going to lead me to, and that's how you make a cube, like procedurally. Right. You know, like like I just put all these nodes together just so I can like specify like which faces face where, and it's like, but now you have so much control over all the faces, and I'm like, like okay.
With those first early games, you felt like every single game you picked up, they were inventing a new mechanic.
Right.
You know, every game was different. So it was really exciting to pick up a new game and figure out what new kind of gameplay have they introduced with this thing. So you got to see the medium kind of evolve from nothing. Nowadays, I think there's a lot more conventions as to what the game is and what you can and can't do. But back then, it was just the Wild West. It was like every game was trying something new, And some things would stick, some things wouldn't, you know. And that was, to me, just I love that aspect. It's probably an aspect of gaming I kind of miss a little bit these days.
Yeah.
Like some of that energy is not there anymore. But I'm hoping, you know, I think there's an opportunity with new tools that will kind of get back to some of that energy.
Right. What I'm kind of wondering is, like, do you have any sort of standout mechanics or ways a game functions from games in your childhood or, you know, early teen years or whatever that you don't see anymore?
So, I mean, a game I was hooked on as a kid was Elite. I don't know if it was like
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it was the first kind of real 3D experience, and the whole thing, it was a procedurally generated galaxy that you fly around, and it felt very open world. I mean, open world is very trendy now, and you have things like No Man's Sky, which is kind of like a descendant of Elite in a way, because Elite was crazy programming. I think the whole thing was 64K, and they found a way to like generate just star systems and planets you travel to, and AI that felt at the time kind of convincing, like you were bumping into space pirates that would try to take the goods you're traveling from one system to another. You buy goods at one system and sell them at another.
That's
and pirates
kind
would try to intercept you along the way. I know it was for the time. It was mind blowing achievement at the time that this was all
what year was this? Because you're describing something that sounds like, even when I try to think about it in like a text based way, I'm like, that's still a lot.
Yeah, this was like 84. I'm probably getting the year wrong, but it felt like 84 or something like that.
Okay.
And it was on the BBC Micro, and it was wireframe, you know, but it had like back face culling, so it felt kind of convincing. Like it was very clever design. They worked within their limitations, so all the spaceships were like kind of convex, so that you could hide the back faces, and they felt kind of solid, even though it was a really good example of working within your limitations, the limitations you had, and just like making something that far surpassed its limits. You know,
it sounds
like what should have been possible, and just little things like the procedural naming of planets and stuff. Like it very convincingly created something. A world inside your computer that you could explore. I think that was one of the first things that really hooked me on gaming. It was like this idea that there was a world inside there that you could go in and explore and go out. You know, was I can imagine myself like also being very hooked on something like that. It's crazy that, like, you know, I feel like I had a much more limited library to choose from, or exposed to, I should say. Mm-hmm. You know. That does make me think of a moment ago. I was thinking, have you seen that Black Mirror episode, that interactive Netflix? Yeah.
Bandersnatch. So that's kind of, that was sort of your, like, you know, like growing up, or you grew up kind of in the midst of all that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I had a neighbor who made games, you know, and like I would go over and
that is so sick.
Yeah, and there were early game studios where you would go over, and there was a couple of people working in their bedroom, you know, like,
right.
And there were opportunities there because the industry was so new that you could get your stuff on shelves and people playing your games, and
right.
It was still the Wild West. It was very open.
Did you ever have that thing? I've heard sort of stories about like. About you can, like, radio stations would broadcast like tone so you could basically record and have a game.
Oh yeah, that seems vaguely familiar. I haven't thought about that in a while. Yeah, it makes sense because you could literally hear your game loading off the audio cassette.
Like, yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
that'd be insane. Yeah. That'd be insane. What a time. You know, see, I'm like upset that I wasn't there for things like that. Of course, like I'm so spoiled rotten with like all these other 10 times more sort of technically amazing things, but like stuff like that, the romanticism behind stuff like that just sounds awesome. I think that's so
it was a lot of fun. Yeah. The downsides of like there was a perception at the time that a store opened in my town where I could go get. It was kind of hard to buy video games. Like where do you go buy them? It's not like today where there's every store stocks games. So in the town where I lived, a little like electronics store opened up, and I went down there and said, I want to buy a video game. And the owner is like, video games aren't software. It's like
What does that even mean? What?
I know, because in his head, video games were this entirely different. It wasn't real software.
Yeah.
He was selling real software, which was like spreadsheets and word processors and stuff. And he wasn't going to be stocking any video games in his store.
All this humdrum shit that it just goes. It's from generation to generation. It just there's always going to be that guy. There's always going to be that. That is so funny. I would say that you got your hands on some cooler games than I did when I was a kid. Being exposed to something like that, I could imagine would push anybody closer to wanting to be involved with that. You know, it's inspiring, one thing, to have a lot of fun playing Mario or whatever, but I think to say oh, there's a world inside of there. I didn't get that until a lot later, probably until some games with Super Nintendo. You know, I think Earthbound was one of the first times I ever felt that. And, you know, that went down to be one of my favorite games of all time. But I think really when I started seeing as I can get lost in it regularly, the medium itself lends itself well to this, was with Nintendo 64. You know, so I was already probably accustomed to video games, but it took a minute before something actually gave me the same experience as what Elite sounds like it did for you. Has adulthood kind of given you some pretty sort of what it sounds like a profound experience, or at least a really long-lasting sort of impression that it's left on you, like Elite did? Has there been any of those kind of experiences as an adult? Yeah,
I mean, there are some amazing games, Shadow of the Colossus stands out. Journey, Eco. Journey is that game company,
right?
And they also made Flower and Flow. Is it Flow? Where you were the little microbes swimming around, evolving, eating other things.
Right.
I love the experiences they make, because they kind of harken back, for me anyway, to those early days where there's some really simple idea you're exploring, and you're not getting lost in all these details of other systems that you're trying to add on. And a lot of times it's marketing wanting to add on features because they think it will sell more or whatever.
Right.
There's a purity to just exploring one simple idea that I really when I see that in a game, I really appreciate that, because that's another area that I've had an interest in through the years, is narrative in video games, and it's been such an interesting challenge to see and to see the different ways people tackle narrative. You do the cutscene, non-interactive things that just stuck in there. You try to do world building to get your story across. But to me, Shadow of the Colossus is just one of the most successful narrative experiences, because you tell the story entirely in the experience. There's no cutscenes. There might be a couple. There's
a couple, but it is predominantly through the gameplay.
Yeah, and just the music and the feelings it evokes. As the mission you're charged with is to take down these amazing creatures, and then they play this. And when you succeed, they play this horrible, sad music. And it's just it's a very successful, I think, experiment in creating interactive narrative experience.
Yeah, that guy definitely pushes it.
Yeah. Same thing with Ico before that, where it's just in the moment narrative experience of it. You feel like you're living the story, and there's definitely a story there. Those are very successful experiments, I think, in interactive storytelling. I wish there were more kind of experiences like that, instead of the really heavy-handed, authored, cutscene heavy, I'm gonna tell this one specific story of it. It doesn't let you get into you have super specific characters that you can't get into because I don't know, some meathead jock psycho basically that you're playing. That to me is a very interesting. Where does that stuff go? How do we leave some room for the player to inhabit the character and explore a world and still feel like you're inside a real story and not just some open-ended experience, Right. So there's a nice balance of things that has to happen there. That's very interesting.
Something that's happened to me over many years, since teenage years, was having the desire to play games. Literally I have this kind of image in my head that I know I've been there a million times, where I'm flipping through all the games that I have, going, oh, which one of these do I want to play? But, you're flipping through your games, and it's kind of none of them are standing out to you. It's kind of you're in the mood for something, and it's they don't really they're kind of not speaking to you in that moment or something. But then there are some games that just kind of like that this is just good all the time. And for me, what that always ends up being have been games that were more sort of like, I don't want to say this with a capital S, but systemic, you know, and I don't want to say it with a capital P, but procedural, you know, games that were more open-ended on sort of like the possibilities of sort of like emergent narrative, you know, like those, I feel you on the sort of like wanting more of that, because my eyes, they just glaze over when somebody is giving me, like, I hate to say it, but like a written narrative. More often than not, that's what it is. Like the more sort of writing that is done, the more like character building that like a person did, there's a higher likelihood that I will become like bored of it if it's in a game, because I have that expectation of wanting to be involved. My brain is in this mode when I'm holding a controller or a mouse and keyboard that, like, you know, I want to be doing something, you know, I want to be involved in it, not watching or whatever. Where do you feel about, because I feel like somebody who's kind of teetered sort of precariously on the edge of both of those was Hideo Kojima, like the Metal Gear games, giving us really weird moments, but also so many of his games are basically movies. They're just, you're watching a cutscene. But I think of extraordinarily experimental moments. Like, did you ever play through all of them or anything?
I love those. Yeah, I love those games. Stands out for me. There's a scene, I think, where you're supposed to snipe a target. You've got the target in your snipe, and every time you pull the trigger, your character says, "I can't do it. I can't do it."
I don't remember that, but that sounds crazy.
Yeah, and it was a really simple little thing, but it got you into a mind. It was an effective piece of storytelling, and it didn't take away your agency.
Yeah,
it kind of does take away your agency, but it does it in service of an interesting narrative beat.
Right.
So that those kind of little experiments, I love seeing those. Or even something like God of War. There's a sequence in that where you have to hug people to give them energy. You're in the middle of some boss fight and you're running around and I forget whether it's to give them energy or get energy. You're like hugging people in the middle of this super violent game.
Like proper hugging, like not just not grappling, but like proper. This is a hug with love.
Because there's that undercurrent in the story. I don't remember it super well, but there's the undercurrent in the story. You've lost your family, and there's some sadness behind the anger. There's some sadness, and there's some cliched rage stuff in that game. But at the same time, they brought it back sometimes to these little interesting experiments like that. I love seeing those little experiments, especially in like a mainstream high budget game. Like those little sequences that stand out. Like, whoa, did they just do that? It feels like something that wouldn't normally get past the design and into the game. And I love seeing those sequences in games.
Have you ever cried playing a game?
I think this is a common one for my generation, I think, but there was like this text adventure called Planetfall.
Okay. I haven't heard of that one.
There was a little robot companion you had in that. At some point he dies.
Oh no. Uh-huh.
And you've grown quite attached to his presence in the game. There's something those text adventures captured very well, is there was a lot of irreversible actions in those games. Like the real consequence, like you did something and you just moved on from that, accepting what happened because that choice you made, and the game just kept moving forward. Actions felt kind of meaningful in those games. Right,
it's like the whole crux of a text adventure.
Yeah, exactly.
It's literally the choices you make. That's crazy.
Yeah. Even though the games had other problems in terms of like guessing the words you're supposed to use and stuff, but some some aspects of it were really pretty effective.
Why can't I run away? Oh, I need to flee, FLEE, like
exactly. That stuff's annoying. Actually, it'd be interesting to see with all the advancements in like natural language and like AI and machine learning, what that might bring to just the text adventure, or whether it is being there's the whole interactive fiction genre now, whether it's being introduced like to some of the machine learning techniques for like making that stuff more flexible.
I don't know if you ever horsed around with AI Dungeon or Dungeon AI or something like that. It's on iOS. Like I've horsed around with it on my phone, but it lets you pretty much write anything in it, and it plays ball with a lot of things you write,
Yeah.
like to a surprising degree. Like even when you
Cool.
completely break and like go into anachronistic stuff. Have you played Deep Rock Galactic? Have you
No.
heard of Deep Rock? I feel like I'm not sure if I ever went on to you about that, because there was a minute during the pandemic that I got really obsessed with that game, and that's a game in recent times where I didn't cry, but I got to that point where my eyes, I could feel my glands like tingling. Like I can feel muscle spasms about to eject tears, and like, and they were in moments. Like the moment I can remember specifically was like, you're all these different classes, right? You're dwarves, and you're drilling into a planet, and you go and you have a mission. It's procedurally generated and stuff. You have to fight off bugs, and then you usually get the thing, and then get back to the ship and get out of there. And the sort of the phrase or the tagline to the game is "No dwarf left behind," and it's like heavy on co-op. Like you really depend on each other, like Left 4 Dead. And so I've had many moments, but the one I think that illustrates it best is like, I was being totally overwhelmed by these bugs on the last minute. The ship's finally about to land. It's coming. It's like, half a minute away. We're almost out of there, but I get completely overwhelmed. And then one of my friends comes out at the last minute and drops a shield, and like just the shield goes up. And that's a thing that my class didn't have, was a shield. So like in that moment he came and he saved me, and it's just like we're both there back to back, and it's like this very glorious moment. And I just remember, feeling like, like I wouldn't have made it out without him. Sure, that's a thing that happens in games, but something about like, but only he could have done that, because I was not equipped to do that. And the music flaring and sort of like the circumstances that it's put in, and all sort of like the drama that's created by this situation. I just remember just being like, oh man, like I got so choked up, and then we got out of there, and I'm riding high on adrenaline. I was like, that was really emotional. So I'm wondering, have you had any sort of like, because you had this emotional experience that was kind of built around like a drama, like this thing dying, right? Like the robot that you get attached to. Have you ever kind of had like really strong reactions to more like action based games?
Yeah, so when I was working in an office environment more, where we play Counter-Strike a lot.
Okay. Yeah.
At the end of the day, you get, and there are games like that. Yeah.
Okay.
And what was the other game? No, it was a bigger shooter. It was like one of the first shooters that let you play with
like
more
Quake?
people. No, it was past that, but it had a lot of World War II scenarios, like Iwo Jima and stuff. But something those games did really well is the like you talked about, the stories you could tell afterwards.
Yeah.
When the systems are balanced really well, and the gameplay generates stories that you get together. I remember a lot of those games you would play for a bunch, and it was super addictive and fun. But then, as much fun as that was, after the game was over, you'd all get together and replay kind of the highlights. You talk about, remember when that happened. And that's just a sign of a super well-designed game, where you can talk about it afterwards like it was a movie, because it generated all these cinematic moments where, like you said, it was the timing, it just naturally generates these moments,
right?
That you can talk about afterward. That to me is that's the super interesting aspect of a game. Like, how do you? The iteration that went into the rules for that game to be able to generate those moments is just insane.
Yes.
And then they make it look so easy, like you don't even think about, after you finish the game, you're just like, of course it all worked like that,
Right.
But that didn't happen by accident, and that's a very interesting aspect of game development. Like, how do you do that stuff? Right.
And those have, I've noticed that a lot of those games too have been like, simple. They've been very simple systems. They're not they definitely have their complexities. I would say, Deep Rock is complex and stuff, but sort of like they are broad brushstrokes, and they just kind of, they work really well that way.
There's a core that's super, like I remember Counter-Strike, the big innovation at the time was when you died, you were out of that round, and you were sitting on the sidelines watching your friends teammates try and win.
Right.
But that was like a big, again, consequence. You felt like if you fuck up and died, you were out of that round. You were letting your friends down because they were now like continuing without you.
Right.
So that was a really interesting extra weight to your actions in that game because of that. And it was a simple little innovation to to the rules, but it added so much, you know.
Would you say that that's kind of like the type of game, let's just call it like an emergent game, games that give like emergent gameplay, sort of like story buildings? Or rather, have you ever heard the term like anecdote generator? I forgot who called their game that, but they were like, oh, we wanted to make an anecdote generator, you know? So it's just people perpetually have the stories to tell each other afterwards. Would you kind of say that is that's your taste, the flavor that you crave of games?
That's definitely one flavor I crave. But at the same time, I love arcade games.
Sure.
You know, like that can be a simple pick up and play mechanic.
Absolutely.
Because I grew up on those, and I love that addictive, that flow state thing where you just like get hooked on and you get a level of mastery of the controls in a game, in a simple arcade game where you can't believe you pulled something off.
Yeah.
You're just so in the zone, and just like anyone watching might think that's crazy, you know. Like I love that state you can get in an action game where it's just, yeah, you can pull off insane things because you're in the moment and you float and you're connected to the controls, and I think time almost slows down, and that is also a very, very seductive part of games for me, is that it's very unique to the medium. There's not many. You're not going to get that feeling watching a movie, you know, or a TV show. It's very unique to games. So exploring what's unique to the medium is probably a bigger umbrella. Like the stuff you're talking about, emergent gameplay, is very, very unique to the medium.
Right.
So any aspect of the medium that really you can only do in that medium. I love exploring that stuff.
You know, I think that's a pretty revealing thing. That I think that's a good way to say it for myself too, which is games that give you an experience that only a game could have given you.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I feel that with a lot of other stuff, like film. When there's films that I feel like I could have enjoyed it the same as a book or a stage play, it becomes, I'm not nearly as interested. My favorite films have always used the medium. What is working on PlayMaker like for you? Like, how often are you thinking about it? Is it so far into development at this point that it's more of a sort of smaller problem solving things, or do you still have, because I can imagine, maybe you don't, maybe you do, maybe you did, have like epiphanies at the beginning of development? They're more sort of like, oh, like I didn't realize maybe I could start doing this with, and then it became like an integral part to the tool or something like that. How is it now as opposed to when you first started building it?
So there's a part early on when you're developing something where it's still kind of flexible into what you can change and play with, and it gets more difficult the longer something's been out and released, because there's just a lot of stuff built around the way it works now. Something I'm focused on for the future is PlayMaker 2, which kind of like condenses a lot of the stuff that worked in PlayMaker 1, but also explores new ideas, is given the opportunity to kind of like reinvent some stuff and like take some lessons and not worry about breaking compatibility with this whole ecosystem of stuff that's out there now. Mm-hmm. So that's very exciting. The future is very exciting from that point of view, like figuring out new. I love prototyping and playing with new ideas, but there's also, it's an interesting challenge to like iteratively also develop something that's out there, and like make it incrementally better based on people's feedback, which is kind of more the stage PlayMaker 1 is in.
Right, it's more of a it's the sort of like housekeeping more. It's like kind of fixing it up, making sure it works. Yeah,
and also because Unity has really accelerated the pace of development in terms of like versions and new features and package managers, all sorts of different packages you can pull into a project. So like kind of making sure PlayMaker works with all of that development is also challenging. You know, it's like, so to keep up with that is an interesting challenge. The opportunity, I think, is because PlayMaker has been out for a long time and people have played with it a lot, is how to condense like lessons learned from that, like what can work better, what can drive development forward in the future. It's been out in the wild, and it's a huge amount of information about the way people have interacted with it, what works, what doesn't.
this would have been a clean segue because you started just talking about PlayMaker 2 on your own, and I didn't have to jump into it. But I'm going to completely ruin that segue because there is a question that I have before I get into PlayMaker 2 is, did you have, or do you have any memories of like mythologized moments where you slipped on the toilet, hit your head, and went like, oh, like, we need to build it something like this, or it should have this action, you know?
I mean, it sounds simple, but an early epiphany I had with PlayMaker was the finished event. Just like, yeah, like that for a long time that wasn't in there. Yeah, and I remember thinking of that, like there should just be an easy way to like transition to another state when all the actions are finished, and it's like, finished event.
Right.
And that was one of those things that just clicked. Like as soon as you think of it and you put it in, and it just works, and then you can't imagine the tool without that thing in it.
Do you remember like the moment?
Vaguely.
Were you at the computer, or were you doing something else?
Oh, I was at the computer, and I remember just kind of like having the thought. It's one of those thoughts where the word kind of generate, like you think, well, something should happen when I finished, and then you think, finished. Just kind of the word just generates the rest of the idea. Right. There's definitely, I tend to write stuff like that down so I can get back to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, because it can strike at any moment. You're just like, that kind of stuff for me with PlayMaker at least was pretty iterative. It would just be stuff like, the focus of PlayMaker is always what do I want to make easy to do, because the focus is on higher level functionality with the actions. It's like, what should be easy? So kind of process I would do a lot is I try to make something, and if it was too many steps and not easy enough to do, like that needs to be simple. That needs to be one action. Mm-hmm. Because the chances of like figuring out how to put all these different components together to come up with that thing that should be easy to do is just too roundabout, you know. So to me, a lot of the process is pretty iterative in terms of like, you try to do something. Is it that did that work well, or does there need to be an easier way to do that?
Right. Like how can this look if I really distilled it?
So a lot of it is really using your own tool, I think, is a big part of it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Like I would this is a lesson I learn again over and over again, is when I go to write documentation. In the process of writing the documentation, you quickly realize something is too roundabout. It's too complicated.
You're writing this huge thing.
Yeah. And I remember learning that. I say I learned this lesson over and over again, because there was this idea back when I was working for companies making games. As a designer, I used to think like we should write the manual first. Like if you try to write the manual for this design.
That's a great way to put it. Oh my god.
Yeah. So I it's a lesson that I keep learning over and over. Like, what if you, for a game design, you're thinking of what if you had to explain it to someone in a manual. We don't write buy manuals anymore, but you used to buy a game and there would be an insert with a paper thing you'd unfold it, and it had to be a pretty concise explanation of the game mechanics and control. Also, that was a really interesting lens back into the design. If you start with that, like, imagine explaining your game mechanic to a player. And if you're getting bogged down and you can't do it, you have to go back and simplify your design or rethink it or something.
Seriously.
So same thing with PlayMaker. Like I would rediscover this over and over, going to write the docs and being like, this is too complicated. There's too many steps. I'm
so happy to hear you say something like that, because I literally just put out a video two weeks ago. I'm giving sort of pieces of advice to keep up with a game project you have and to finish a game, sort of tips and tricks on how to actually begin and finish something. And one of the main points that I tried to drive home is to describe in detail one round of your game, whatever that looks like, you know, because I think a lot of people, I hear it all the time in the chat and the Discord and stuff, they say like, or when people request tutorials and stuff, they say like, can you make a tutorial on like how to make the player attack the enemy? And I'm like, what does that mean? Right. You know, like that is such a wide and broad statement, and I think a lot of people can benefit from, like you say, like writing the manual. Like I think that's a really elegant way to put it, is like write the manual for your game before you start programming it, or at least some semblance of it, you know.
And you have to go back and forth a lot. I mean, like that's one of the things that I love about game development. It's not a linear process. You're not going along. You're going to have to jump around a lot. You're going to have to, you know, they say don't polish stuff before sometimes you have to polish a little bit of your game just to see how it feels and get excited about it.
Exactly.
And then bring that back. And it's not the most efficient process, but it's not.
You don't have a choice.
Yeah, exactly. It's the way it is. You got to jump around, figure stuff out. It's iterative. It's messy. You don't know on what's going to work. You're gonna have to try it. You're gonna have to go back and change things based on what you learned with little prototypes. It's what makes it a great, interesting medium. It is messy like that. You're gonna have to jump around a lot.
For real. Last thing on the table here is PlayMaker 2.
I think it's probably premature.
Okay.
Yeah. If anything, there would be an opportunity a little down the line to do like a sneak peek. Or we could even show like those GIFs I sent you guys.
Mm-hmm. The public ultrasound would be a GIF like that.
So I definitely want to tease that at some point.
Okay. So let me just say this then for the video. We're no PlayMaker 2 teases. I've seen things that you, the audience, probably won't see for a while. So haha. Yeah, you're just gonna have to wait. It's awesome. That being said, do you have anything that you would like to say to the PlayMaker community?
Really, the community's been just a huge part of the journey with PlayMaker. A bit of advice that I keep relearning is like to release something early so that you can start that conversation with people. That conversation will bring such a huge amount to the project. You can't think of everything, every scenario in your head. You have to. It has to be an iterative thing where it's out there, it's in the wild, it's evolving with people's input. And really, that's been a huge part of PlayMaker's journey. As part of its success is the community, and that's something we definitely want to build on further with PlayMaker 2.
Those are huge shoulders to stand on, right? PlayMaker 2 to stand on the shoulders of PlayMaker 1, like because of not only what you built, of course, like the work that you and Jean and anybody else involved in the actual development part it's been amazing. But yeah, that makes sense that like the community's already there, and that's, as you said, like that's been some of the more useful information that you could have ever gotten out of, other than just sitting and brewing internally and trying to think of everything yourself.
Also, big shout out to Jean.
Yeah.
We really couldn't have made PlayMaker without him, because he was actually a part of our community. He was just very active on the forums, and we kind of like recruited him to be a key member of PlayMaker development years ago. Through the community, we find collaborators, people we want to work with going forward, and that's just also been very rewarding, to kind of like close the loop there and have it be this thing that generates its own momentum in that way. I think it's good advice for people to release and start that conversation with your users, with people who are actually using the thing you're making. Be it a game or a tool or anything, it brings such a huge amount to it will change the product in a good way.
You're saying that, and I'm like, man, I need to put my thing out already. I need to have people start testing this thing.
Yeah, it's just a unique property of interactive mediums is you cannot predict how they are going to work with people,
right?
Because you have to get it out there and just respond to how what works, what doesn't work, whether it's a tool or a game or anything, because it's the variable that's just you can't predict how it's going to work in the wild.
That is a very good piece of advice that I think we can use to end on. That is a common thing that that is talked about with everybody that's on my Discord and all the subs. Probably a bunch of people watching have heard me spout off enough about that's the name of the jam, right? The name of the jam that's coming up right now is the Just Fucking Finish jam. Like, you need to put something out, you need to see how the world reacts to your thing. So I think that's brilliant, and thank you for your time. Probably end up chit-chatting with you later as we figure out this next tutorial that we're putting out. So stay tuned for these next tutorials, folks. They're going to be good ones. They're highly requested. Can't say what they are just yet, but you'll see. So, ladies and gentlemen, Alex Chouls, creator of PlayMaker, hot damn. Give him hella thumbs up and nice things in the comments, because he's empowered pretty much everybody who's on this channel. So thanks, man. I'll hit you up after this. I'm just gonna hang up and stop the recording.